Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series examining the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 34 for Sunday the 15th of July 2018, and today we are looking at the 1969 World War II epic movie Battle of Britain. It's directed by Guy Hamilton and starring pretty much everyone except Richard Burton and Alec Guinness. My name is Martin Darlington, and this week I am again solo, so apologies for the lack of those measured and knowledgeable Australian tones, but Andrew is on another... Oh no, sorry, that was the first draft. Andrew is on a well-earned holiday. Errata and updates for this week basically is see listener feedback. There's no new reviews, and so straight into the listener feedback. And Philip Pomerantz, our beloved doctor, he wrote in, "Dear Martin and Andrew, thank you for the shout out, and we enjoyed Mrs. Brown." Philip is a semi-retired physician, and he explained the erysipelas condition that John Brown died from is a strep infection. It is of the skin, as we got that bit right, but it's got nothing in common with psoriasis, which is a non-infectious disorder. Philip points out that in the pre-antibiotic era, erysipelas, I hope I'm saying that correctly, like scarlet fever, which is also a strep infection, could easily be fatal. If you didn't succumb to the infection itself, you could die from the kidney failure from what was then called Bright's disease, which was a post-strep inflammation of the kidneys and frequently fatal, especially in adults. Now it's easily cured with penicillin thanks to Alexander Fleming. Philip also suggests two further films for us to cover, and these are definitely on the long list. Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, both directed by Clint Eastwood, and probably would suit a double film episode. And Philip offered his services as a medical consultant for the show if we have similar questions in the future. So if anyone else was thinking of applying for that voluntary, unpaid and hitherto unadvertised post, I'm afraid it's just been filled. Now, if you remember Scott Jeffrey, Scott is a professor at the University of Alberta, the Ales department, nothing to do with beer. And Scott had discovered us a couple of months ago and was on a kind of binge listening catch-up. And he sent me a tweet at the end of the TV specials, Supplement 3, episode 31, where we did say to him, look, when you get this far, give us a tweet and we'll work out your rate of listening. So he's made it up till there, contacting you as requested. Had hoped to be all caught up by now, but not quite. By Scott's reckoning, he's about averaging 40 minutes a day. He said, it feels like less, so kudos on entertainment value. Maybe I need to reevaluate my time management strategies. So Scott's only got Mrs. Brown, Saving Mr. Banks, Mrs. Brown, and now, of course, Battle of Britain, and he's up to speed with the rest of us. We've also heard from new listener Ben Robertson. Welcome aboard, Ben. He's listened to 300 and Mrs. Brown. That's a very early episode and the very latest episode until this one. But the reason for that was a bit of a problem with iTunes subscription. What Ben has identified is episode 8, Zulu, is not downloading. Now, I have had a look around and he's absolutely right. There's a problem with it. WordPress gave us some suggestions at first on Ben's personal problem with subscription, and hopefully that seems to have worked. He had to click subscription again with iTunes, but WordPress can't help us with the actual link to Zulu on iTunes, so I've emailed Apple at iTunes and I don't expect to hear from them ever. Probably I might do. They've not been great at getting back to us. So I have some choices. I can delete Zulu from the library and reinstall it as episode 8, but it's going to appear completely out of kilter. If anyone listening has tried to listen to Zulu, for example, a new listener like Ben, it is working on SoundCloud, on Podbean, not on Stitcher because they use the iTunes link. So obviously there's a problem with that episode. The others seem to be okay. And you can listen directly from the website. Just scroll to the bottom of the episode's page and you can click on the Zulu page there if you want to read the notes, or you can just play it from the episode's page with the player. And we will look into getting a download option onto the website itself, so you can actually download episodes onto a phone or a listening device such as an iPod. So thank you for that, Ben. I'm sorry you had problems, but I'm glad you fixed everything except Zulu. That's my job, and I will try and get on with it. Donations. We'd like to return to Philip Pomerantz and thank him for his incredibly generous donation. The time and thought that went into the email was reward enough, but to receive a donation really topped the already iced cake with a glacé cherry. So Philip and Mrs. Pomerantz, thank you very much indeed. The next episode is going to be Victoria and Abdul revisiting Queen Victoria, as portrayed by Judi Dench, and her close friendship with an Indian servant, Abdul Karim, who she met a few years after the death of John Brown. See episode 33. And before we launch into the main part of the show, I would just like to say how proud I am of myself that I've managed to keep the remit tight, just doing the movie about the Britain, not going off down any rabbit holes. I'd like to say that, but that would be a terrible lie, because I'm afraid I am going to go off on tangents. Hopefully you find them interesting and relevant, but they're things I feel quite strongly about. So as Andrew's not here to restrain and guide me, I'm afraid today I may resemble an unguided missile. But for those who want to hear about the Battle of Britain movie, I will leave the tangent ranting to the end. But I would ask people to listen, because there's information there that, I don't know, not a lot of people know, or I certainly didn't know until I started researching some time ago, and then I've done a bit more in-depth research for this episode, and it's about Poland and the way the Allies in particular, who had a greater moral duty towards the Poles, I believe, have kind of written them out of World War II history, and certainly the success story that their forces in exile wrote for themselves and on our behalf. However, that will come at the end, so if you really don't want to know about that, you just want to know about the movie, you'll know when we get there. And now, speaking of the movie, let's get on with it. The story of the movie. Released in 1969, directed by Guy Hamilton, who had already directed The Colditz Story, another stiff upper lip British war movie. Hamilton also notched up Dr. No and Goldfinger in the James Bond franchise before he made Battle of Britain. And after Battle of Britain, he would go on to direct 3 more Bond movies: Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die, and Man with the Golden Gun. The movie was based on a book, The Narrow Margin, by Derek Dempster and Derek Wood. Screenwriters are credited as James Kennaway and Wilfried Greatorex. Technical advisors included Adolf Galland, who'd commanded a Luftwaffe fighter squadron during the battle, both of whom wrote memoirs of the Battle of Britain and indeed the rest of the war. Galland, renowned as a gentleman by everyone who met him after the war, nearly walked off set a number of times at the stereotypical portrayal of the Germans, which led to several scenes being rewritten and reshot. Guy Hamilton shot the movie in the UK and Spain, where many of the German aircraft were to be found, actually serving in the Spanish Air Force, and he insisted on as many genuine aircraft as possible. The Messerschmitt Bf-109s were actually Spanish Buchons made under licence, but ironically they were powered by Rolls-Royce Merlin engines rather than the Daimler-Benz engines that would be found in the real Messerschmitts. The only aircraft type that aren't real are the Stukas, which, as most people can quite clearly see, are model aircraft. Several actual RAF World War II stations were used, and the bombing raid that is seen destroying a hangar was RAF Duxford, where they did need to knock a hangar down, so the movie did the job for them, and the same was done in London's Docklands to simulate the Luftwaffe raids. The cast list was a checklist of everyone who was anyone in British movie acting in the 1960s, except Richard Burton, who must have been busy. Maybe Elizabeth Taylor wouldn't allow him out. Laurence Olivier, Michael Caine, Christopher Plummer, Ian McShane, Edward Fox, Michael Redgrave, Trevor Howard, Kenneth Moore, who of course would also star as Squadron Leader Douglas Bader in Reach for the Sky, Robert Shaw, and for the German side, Kurt Jürgens, who would go on to be a very menacing Bond villain in The Spy Who Loved Me. Jürgens had been born in Germany in 1915, so he was an eligible age to serve in the Second World War, but far from serving the forces, he actually ended up in a concentration camp for political unreliables, which led him to become an Austrian citizen after the war. So from a post-Second World War non-German perspective, chapeau to Kurt Jürgens. Now, earlier we mentioned Alec Guinness. Now, he was hired to play Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production, but the scenes were deemed superfluous and were never actually filmed. Director Guy Hamilton's insistence on genuine aircraft and extensive aerial sequences led to a massive, for the era, budget of $12 million, and worldwide the movie actually made a loss. This was despite the cast being paid a flat rate dependent on the spoken parts, irrespective of their fame, and yet they all cheerfully volunteered, so we read. For some reason, despite the very senior officers like Sir Hugh Dowding, Air Vice Marshals Keith Park and Trafford Leigh-Mallory, and the German staff officers being named on the real characters, the flying characters, the squadron leaders on both sides, are fictional names but often based on real characters. For example, Maya Fern and Maya Falker, Major in English, are meant to represent Mulders and Galland, the real fighter leaders on the Luftwaffe side. Robert Shaw's squadron leader Skipper, which is how he's credited in the cast list, is said to be based on Sailor Milan, a tough, no-nonsense South African who commanded 74 Squadron RAF during the battle, and whose real first name was Adolf, somewhat unfortunately. Sir Hugh Dowding, elderly, ill and wheelchair-bound by the time of the movie's release, did visit the set and spoke with Laurence Olivier, who was playing him in the movie, and one account I read said it wasn't quite clear who was more starstruck. The movie won just one BAFTA for the soundtrack, which was written by Ron Goodwin of Dam Busters fame, but retaining some clips written by a previously employed composer, Sir William Walton. On Rotten Tomatoes, the movie only scores 63%, but it has become a bit of a staple for British war movie fans to watch over the years. I'm not sure what international audience it's had, but the aerial scenes were fantastic, and on such a huge scale, you might even argue that it eclipsed Top Gun's aerial scenes, which is probably what that movie's most applauded for. So, on with the movie itself, and we'll lead in with a little bit of Ron Goodwin's music. The opening scene tells us it's 1940, and we see a Hurricane doing a victory roll over a French airfield as unimpressed British troops and French refugees traipse along a road below. We meet Squadron Leader Harvey, played by Christopher Plummer, who gives the aerobatic pilot Jamie a rollicking after he's landed, and in the background we see three Hurricanes taxiing in behind them. One of the young pilots says, "Is it reinforcements, sir?" But as the aircraft park up, we see coming across towards Squadron Leader Harvey another squadron leader. This is Squadron Leader Skipper, played by Robert Shaw, trailed by a young officer pilot, Archie, Edward Fox, and a sergeant pilot whose name is Andy, played by Ian McShane. And we've got a little clip of the meeting of the two squadron leaders.
Hello, Harvey. Where's Jumbo?
Posted missing last night.
You acting CO?
Oh, yeah. Of what? 5 serviceable aircraft, no spares, no contact.
First we knew the bastard had overrun us was when we tried to land.
I think the clip illustrates the shock that the British forces as well as the French forces were in, and it's clear that the Germans are overrunning the defences. A French liaison pilot arrives in a car and says it's no use, the Germans will be here in half an hour. As Harvey's pilots clamber aboard their Hurricanes, Jamie, the young officer who performed the opening barrel roll, whistles to the dejected-looking French pilot who's being left behind, and he manages to squeeze into the one-man cockpit with young Jamie. The fighters take off and head west as the remaining ground crew, setting fire to aircraft left on the ground, see Messerschmitt 109s arrive on strafing runs. Air Ministry is the next scene, and Fighter Command's Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding's voice is heard, played by Laurence Olivier, reading a letter appealing to the Air Minister that no more of his fighters be sent to France.
To the Permanent Secretary of State for Air. Sir, I have the honor to refer to the very serious calls which have recently been made upon Fighter Command in an attempt to stem the German invasion of the continent. I hope and believe that our armies may yet be victorious in France and Belgium, but we have to face the possibility that they may be defeated. In this case, I presume that there is no one who will deny that England should fight on, even though the remainder of the continent of Europe is dominated by the Germans. I must therefore request that not one more fighter be sent across the Channel. If the home defense is drained away in desperate attempts to remedy the situation in France, defeat in France will involve the final, complete, and irremediable defeat of this country. I have the honor to be, sir, your obedient servant, H.C.T. Dowding.
So a reality check on the opening scenes. The German advance didn't get the name Blitzkrieg for nothing. It literally means lightning war. They came through the Ardennes, which Allied commanders thought impossible with armoured units because of the dense forests, and they outflanked the Maginot Line, the huge French defences lining their border. Unfortunately, the French defences, the Maginot Line itself, went up to the Belgian border. The French invited, when they were building it, the Belgians to have it extended around their country as well, but the Belgians didn't want to antagonise the Germans, so they said no. At which point, really, pragmatically, the French should have said, well, fair enough, we're going to continue to the coast and you'll be on the outside. But they didn't. They just stopped with the Maginot Line sort of hanging in thin air. And it should be no surprise to anyone that, of course, the Germans repeated the Schlieffen plan of the First World War and hooked through Belgium and the Netherlands and came in behind the Maginot Line, making it completely redundant. As far as Hugh Dowding's appeals, it was true. He was desperately concerned as Winston Churchill kept promising more fighters to help France, and Dowding successfully at this stage finally managed to put a stop to it, and because he was aware that they were just going to lose aircraft. No Spitfires served in France, only Hurricanes went, although they were very effective aircraft and could take a lot of punishment, but Dowding wanted to husband his own resources, as he says in the letter, and Britain was left alone, having to look to its own defences. Incidentally, in the movie, there are a lot of times where people refer to England when, of course, they mean Britain or the United Kingdom. Slightly snobby English 1960s mentality, I suspect. So back to the movie, and the action switches to France, where German troops are seen strolling into Dunkirk. We know it's Dunkirk because there's a very usefully placed fallen road sign. The abandoned equipment of the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, is seen on the beaches. And then we get the opening titles and the Luftwaffe March, which we heard right at the beginning between the intro and the story of the movie. Very stirring piece of music, actually written for the film. It's not a real Luftwaffe March. We see a Junkers 52 transport plane deliver a senior German officer to be met by assembled staff officers as Heinkel 111 bombers are lined up with their crews for his inspection. The senior officer is taken to the Luftwaffe headquarters overlooking the Channel, where more bombers are lined up. Next, the staff officer is seen off to his plane, and we next see him in Berlin, where he and a colleague have just had an audience with Adolf Hitler. They leave, bemoaning Hitler's opinion that England are not Germany's natural enemy, but the two air officers agreed that the British are on their knees and need to be finished off. The next person called in to see the Führer is Baron von Richter, played by Kurt Jürgens, the German ambassador to Switzerland. Cutting to the Swiss residence of Sir David Kelly, the British ambassador, we see von Richter arrive to be warmly greeted by the British ambassador's wife, who clearly knows him. They're on first name terms. The encounter of the ambassadors is frosty.
What's left of your army abandoned its weapons at Dunkirk. You're defenseless and just playing for time. We know the moves you're making in Washington, and we know the Americans won't be drawn in. Their embassy in London gives you 2 weeks.
So what's stopping you?
Look, David, the Führer is being very reasonable. He offers guarantees.
Experience shows the Führer's guarantees guarantee Nothing.
David, we are not asking for anything. Europe is ours. We can walk into Britain whenever we like.
If you think we're going to gamble on Herr Hitler's guarantees, you're making a grave mistake. We're not easily frightened. Also, we know how hard it is for an army to cross the channel. Last little corporal who tried came a cropper. So don't threaten or dictate to us until you're marching up Whitehall. And even then we won't listen.
Von Richter leaves, and the ambassador, Sir David Kelly that is, his wife comes into the room, and he says to her, "It's unforgivable. I lost my temper." And the maddening thing is the Germans are right. So, what's the reality of all of that? Going back to the German Luftwaffe officers meeting Hitler, it certainly was a sense of inevitability over Britain's surrender, and lots of German memoirs at the time say, well, it's just a matter of time, as soon as they see sense and realise the situation, and therein they'll come to the negotiating table. And their disbelief at the British stupidity at refusing to negotiate is reflected in several memoirs that I've read, although they do say, I suppose with hindsight, I guess they were right. Goering and the senior staff officers were very keen to attack Britain, believing they could bring the country to its knees purely through air power. That miscalculation was made later in the war by Allied air commanders. The meeting between the ambassadors did take place, and the British ambassador did make comments similar to those shown, but he actually later wrote that he thought Britain probably should have negotiated, at least to see what the Germans were offering. His instructions for London, though, were to be told in no uncertain terms that his approach was to be flat refusal, and he certainly played his part well. Back to the movie, and we see an airfield in England. Skipper's squadron are lounging in deck chairs drinking tea, having re-equipped to Spitfires. As Archie and Andy, played by Edward Fox and Ian McShane, sit, Spitfire tries to land, having not lowered its undercarriage. A red flare is fired to wave off the aircraft that then flies a circuit to land safely. The pilot is met by squadron leader skipper, Robert Shaw, who finds out the young man, Simon I think his name is, has 10.5 hours on Spitfires. Skipper says, right, let's make it 11. So he takes him up into the air again for some hard lessons, telling the pilot to try and evade him as he simulates an attack.
Hello, Rabbit Leader. I thought you might come in from the sun.
Don't think, don't just glance. Look, search for the bastards, and never fly in a straight line or you're a dead duck.
Sir.
Now let's try it again.
Reality check. The inexperience of Simon is in no way exaggerated. There were young men being sent to frontline squadrons and going into battle with, in some cases, single hours of flying on the Spitfire, and probably only 30 or 40 hours on training aircraft before that. Also, a quick note about officer and sergeant pilots, and as a former senior NCO pilot myself, I'm trying not to get too huffy about this, but the split during the Battle of Britain was about 60% officers and 40% NCOs in fighter command. In Bomber Command, there was a far higher proportion of NCO pilots, and by the end of the war, the NCOs were in the majority. Many NCOs who proved to be adept fighter pilots would be commissioned during and after the battle, but Ian McShane plays the only speaking sergeant pilot in the movie, with one or two seen later on in the background. Just saying. Now, the other common criticism of this movie is the preponderance of Spitfires against Hurricanes, whereas in the real battle, Harriers made up nearly 70% of the aircraft and correspondingly shot down 70% of the German aircraft that were shot down. The reason for this is actually really pragmatic, and it's just by 1969 there were very few flyable Hurricanes. I think Guy Hamilton managed to get hold of 3, and I believe there's only 2 or 3 still flying in the world today, at least one of them with the Battle of Britain flight flown by the RAF. But there were lots of Spitfires. I mean, there's over 50 or 60 still flying in the world now in 2018. So that's the reason. There's a very good fictional TV series that ITV aired some years ago called Piece of Cake, based on an excellent book by Derek Robinson. And Piece of Cake starts in France, and they flew Spitfires. And a little note from the producers says at the beginning, yes, we know no Spitfires flew in France, but we got hold of 12 Spitfires to help us make this series, and we could only get hold of one Hurricane. So for realism, that's often the reason. Okay, back to the movie. We have a briefing going on where the radar system is being explained to fighter controllers, by RAF fighter controllers, all of them pilots either grounded or too injured to return to flying. It's a clever way of explaining to us, the audience, how the whole system worked and which RAF fighter groups are distributed where. We learn that 11 Group, commanded by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, will bear the brunt because they're based in the southeast of England. Back across the channel, assembled Luftwaffe commanders await the arrival of the Inspector General, Feldmarschall Milch. He's impressed by the morale of the young men and is shown to a telescope from where he can see Dover's White Cliffs and a radar station. England's secret weapon, a young fighter pilot jokes, but all the better if they know we're coming. And we also meet Major Falker, played by Manfred Rederman, which is worth remembering is based on Adolf Galland. Falker is a fighter ace we will meet again. In reality, the Germans did know about radar and were in fact developing their own version. What they hugely underestimated was the integrated communication system into which the radar made its input. This was the most powerful defensive weapon the RAF had after the aircraft themselves, and it certainly enabled a lot of joined up thinking when it came to defending. Gone were the days of World War I where you launched fighter squadrons based on where you thought probably the enemy hopefully would be, maybe. So it was pretty scientific, it was very well organised, and it actually proved very durable. Back to the movie, and we see the Air Minister in very bullish mood talking to Dowding and showing amazement that the Germans who were rolling up France have stopped. He comments that Hitler is said to be sightseeing in Paris. He says to Dowding that Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production, can deliver 100 aircraft a week, and he reminds Dowding about the importance of radar. Dowding agrees and said, yeah, it's vital, but it won't shoot down aircraft. The bottom line is that our young men must shoot down their young men at a rate of 4 to 1, and the piece says the RAF have 650 fighters against the Germans' 2,500 aircraft. The reality is that Dowding's caution was legendary, but with hindsight, probably necessary. The numbers of available aircraft is also not quite accurate. The Germans didn't have that many they could put into the air at any one time, and the British were actually pretty well equipped with aircraft. The shortage, as identified by Dowding, was with pilots. Back to the movie, and we meet Squadron Leader Colin Harvey, played by Christopher Plummer again, as he hands over command to Squadron Leader Canfield, played by Michael Caine. Harvey's heading up to London for a weekend, then he's going to Scotland to take charge of training new pilots. As the two squadron leaders chat, one of the young squadron pilots says that he's just going off for an air test, which you get the idea it's a bit of an excuse for him to go flying, but obviously morale is high, and Christopher Plummer laughs and says to Canfield, well, he'll be your problem from now on. He heads off, this is Harvey, and pulls into a pub car park in his sports car, where we meet his wife, played by Susanna York, who's also in RAF uniform. Showing remarkable chauvinism even for a 60s movie portraying 40s society, Harvey is angry because his wife hasn't applied for a transfer to Scotland. She says she can't because she already has a job and it's important. Outside the pub we see some farm workers in civilian clothing armed with shotguns, some old rifles and pitchforks parading, and this is clearly a shot of the Home Guard, so you get the idea that Britain is down to the last line of defences. The reality bit, it's obviously it's fictional, the whole Mr. and Mrs. Harvey romance, bickering, marital situation. It's taken a lot of stick from critics over the years. It doesn't really seem to serve much purpose unless the chauvinistic 1960s filmmakers were thinking, oh, we'll have a little bit of romance to keep the ladies happy after they've been dragged to the cinema by their husbands who want to watch Spitfires in dogfights. I'm not sure, but there are some family drama bit scenes later on which have far more relevance and far more poignancy than this ongoing thing with Susanna York and Christopher Plummer's characters. Anyway, back to the movie. Squadron Leader Canfield's air testing pilot has gone missing, the implication being he's gone looking for trouble or glory. A Hurricane lands at the airfield and Air Vice Marshal Park, played by Trevor Howard, commanding 11 Fighter Group, lands. He knows about the missing pilot and tells Canfield, look, we can't afford to lose pilots this way. We've all done it, but we've got to stop it. And then the scene cuts to a parachute in the English Channel with a body attached to it as a yellow-nosed ME-109 flies past on its way back to France. It's Major Falker. He lands and heads for a fast bath as his friend Major Fern arrives and tells him he's got 5 minutes before they leave for a dinner in Boulogne. Just before they leave for dinner, they're summoned to Wissant, to, I assume, Luftwaffe headquarters. On the drive there, they see pontoons and barges being transported towards the coast. They're briefed that the next day, August the 10th, will be Adlertag, Eagle's Day. They're briefed to attack airfields in southeast England in an attempt to destroy the RAF on the ground. Morale is clearly high as the pilots are briefed. They're cracking jokes and smiling, but Falker reminds his men, keep an eye on your petrol gauges. We'll only have 30 minutes over England before having to head back to base. We see bombers and fighters take off in the early morning light, and meanwhile on radar stations we see WAF, that's the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, radar operators plotting traces on their screens, and at sector headquarters Air Vice Marshal Park asks if any convoys are due, and told none until tonight, he says we better bring more squadrons to standby. The reality on these bits: Air Vice Marshal Park is a fascinating character. Tough New Zealander, like Dowding, had no time for politicking and diplomacy. Told it how he saw it, and he certainly did used to fly around in a Hurricane to visit his stations. He was a decorated World War I fighter pilot and loved by his men, but frowned upon by some superiors, and many have argued that it was only years later he got the credit he deserved for tactics and leadership, because he was not a butt-kissing, diplomatic, aristocratic Englishman. People have said that the Battle of Britain was run by Dowding from day to day, but by Park from hour to hour. On the Luftwaffe front, morale was certainly high. They'd rolled over Poland, they'd rolled over the Netherlands, Belgium, and even France, seen as the most powerful army on the European continent up to that point, and they saw no reason why their success shouldn't continue. A flotilla of Stukas head for the radar station. Pitching over, the obviously model aircraft dive to drop their bombs, with buildings and radar masts being hit. Squadron Leader Canfield's squadron see the Stukas and dive to attack, bringing down a number of the slow dive bombers. They had fixed undercarriage and they were really mobile artillery. They weren't really suited for air-to-air combat. Back at Sector HQ, radar stations start going off the air as they're hit. An armada of German bombers and fighters approach the English coast, and they're being watched by Observer Corps with binoculars, rangefinders and telephones. Without the radar, the Observer Corps now become Britain's eyes and ears. More RAF fighters scramble as the air raid siren is sounded at their base. It's actually RAF Duxford, in reality now the air wing of the Imperial War Museum. And we meet Group Captain Baker, played by Kenneth Moore. He's complaining to his chief warrant officer about litter and dirt, and they clearly assume as they stroll along that the siren is just another drill. Group Captain Baker sees Section Officer Maggie Harvey, Susanna York, Squadron Leader Colin Harvey's wife. And he calls her over and says, "Now, look here, Maggie," he said, "some of your WAFs are using the men's trenches during air raid practice, and they mustn't do this." And as he's speaking, bombs start to fall behind them. All decorum forgotten, they just yell, "Take cover," and leap into the nearest trench as a hangar is destroyed by bombs. Squadron Leader Skipper is just landed, and he walks into his ready shack to be told by a corporal it's a squadron scramble. He says, "Don't be ridiculous, we just landed." Then bombs start to fall, so sprinting for the aircraft, the pilots leap into their Spitfires, taxi out and try and take off. Some are hit before they get away, and then they start looking for targets. Skipper's squadron are directed southeast and they turn in close formation, but Simon, the young pilot we saw Skipper take up for some hard training earlier, gets disorientated and ends up alone. Sadly, he's not alone for long, because the Messerschmitt 109 comes along and shoots him down. Back at the airbase, we see Maggie Harvey seeing her wounded off and wounded and shaken girls away in trucks, but then she has to go to where half a dozen female bodies are laid out, covered in blankets, just their stockinged ankles and shoes poking out the bottom. Reality check on that: the Stukas were used to attack southern England and Isle of Wight radar stations, but the Germans quickly realised that they were far too vulnerable to be used against fighter defences. Radar stations were hit and did go off air, but rarely for more than a few hours at a time. And the images of squadrons taking off whilst bombs fall around them really happened on more than one occasion and must have been absolutely terrifying. It's just the role of luck in warfare. Back to the movie. At Sector HQ, they have a light board with all the different squadrons listed, with lights underneath saying stood down, refueling, in the air, attacking, and all the lights start coming up as they're coming back to land and refuel. Park and his staff officers learn that some squadrons were unable to land at their own base because of bomb damage, and they've had to divert. We then hear a news reporter on the BBC giving the score, and the balance is strongly in the RAF's favour. However, switching to the German HQ, their staff are told that nearly 300 RAF fighters have been destroyed. It's a slightly smarmy staff officer who delivers the news. When he leaves, the German air commander says, "Yeah, the figures can say what they like. Our bombers continue to be intercepted." However, he's come up with a plan. He's going to intensify attacks in the south, but also launch bombers from Norway towards Scotland and the northeast coast of England. Although out of range of their fighters, the smugly smiling Luftwaffe officer says, "Theirs as well. Even a Spitfire can't be in two places at once." Reality check: the BBC reports were based on pilots' claims, and these have been shown over the years to have been massively inflated, but that's by all aircrew of all nations. No one's suggesting anyone tells lies, but if you fire at an enemy aircraft that flashes across your nose and it blows up, you are clearly going to think, "Wow, that was good," and you may not notice the other 2 or 3 of your comrades who are also firing at the same aircraft will also see it explode, assume they've hit it. The movie doesn't actually use tracer bullets. Tracer bullets have a small amount of phosphorescence in their base, which leaves the red, orange, green and white streaks you see in night skies. Anyone who watched news footage of the bombing of Iraq will have seen tracer being fired. The natural inclination as well of anybody surviving combat, there's a euphoria and an adrenaline, and it probably doesn't give for a calm assessment of how well they may have done. And of course people wanted to be successful. The most exaggerated claims were by gunners on bombers, particularly later in the war, and the American Air Force, or the American Army Air Force as they were then, on the B-17s, but that's largely because they were flying by day, so they could see. They had enormous quantities of guns on board the Flying Fortresses, hence the nickname, and if a German Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf flew through the formation and exploded on its way, every gunner who fired at it is probably going to be pretty convinced, "Yeah, I hit it." So it's perfectly understandable, and the movie actually covers this quite nicely, where Squadron Leader Harvey's young lad Jamie, if you remember, he was the lad who did the victory roll at the beginning of the movie. He lands and says, yeah, I got a Heinkel. And the intelligence officer says, "Did you see it crash?" He went, "Did I? Meow, plonk." And he went, "Jolly good. That's 3 of you that got it then." And again, 3 aircraft, 3 Spitfires, all firing at the same target. It crashes, so they get a third of a kill. The Luftwaffe were just as guilty of inflating claims, and it was based on this false belief about the numbers of British aircraft destroyed that they kept thinking the RAF was on its last legs. Thinking that all the fighters must be in the southeast, they launched their bombers from Norway. That bit's true, and we'll go back to the movie and see how that went. So, the next day we see a formation of unescorted Heinkel 111 bombers approaching the northern English coast, and they're pretty smug. One of them smiles to the other and says, "Where is the RAF? Or where's the Royal Air Force?" And then we see Squadron Leader Harvey's trainee fighter squadron appear. The German gunners look relaxed and comfortable until a gunner spots the British squadron.
Versuch doch mal, das ist Spitfire! Help yourself, everybody. There's no fighter escort.
Several bombers are shot down, smashing into the sea below as the Spitfires wreak havoc. The main Battle of Britain theme plays as the slaughter continues. A Heinkel, trailing smoke from a damaged engine, turns and dives in a desperate attempt to escape the fighters. Eventually the fighters break off. Remember, a Spitfire only carried 14 seconds of ammunition, unless you're Tom Hardy in Dunkirk, but let's not go back there. And as they get back, one of them flies a barrel roll over their home airfield. The pilots are being debriefed by their intelligence officer and are disappointed when they realise some of them have also claimed the same kill. Harvey calls over Peter, a fresh-faced young pilot, and congratulates him on his first dogfight before ripping the strip off him for the idiotic barrel roll. As he says, you've just been in combat, you've been shot at, how do you know your controls aren't damaged? The truth about this bit, as we said earlier, the Germans did launch bombers from Norway. They actually wasn't unescorted. It had long-range Me-110 fighter escorts. These were twin-engine planes, very fast in a straight line, a lot of firepower. They had both cannons and machine guns, but they lacked manoeuvrability, and they quickly found out in France and during the southern action in the early Battle of Britain that they were no contest against Spitfires and Hurricanes. So when the RAF squadron turned up, what the Germans did was what the RAF pilots disparagingly referred to as circled the wagons. They literally just went into a large circle, following each other round and covering each other's tails. It made them fairly safe, but did nothing to protect the bombers, so they were effectively unescorted, and they did suffer huge losses. I think 23 bombers were shot down on that particular raid. The Germans didn't try this again. The reason the film doesn't show or mention the 110s is simply that no flying examples existed, and therefore they didn't have the ability to actually show them in the air. And as we've seen, Guy Hamilton was, apart from the Stukas, which were a vital part of the movie, he really didn't see a need to try and use more model aircraft. He wanted real ones. Back to the movie. HQ Fighter Command sees Dowding being briefed on replacement pilots. Some are coming from the Fleet Air Arm, the Navy, some from Army cooperation squadrons, but he's told that the air staff won't send any light bomber pilots in case of invasion because they'll need them to try and bomb the German troops as they land on the beach. Reminded about the foreign squadrons, Dowding says, Poles, Czechs, their English isn't good enough. They don't understand a word said to them on the radio. They're a menace to themselves and us. In the control room, Dowding has shown the result of the Luftwaffe's northern raid. 23 German planes shot down with no loss to the RAF. And looking across the plotting chart, he sees raid after raid crossing the channel as fighter squadrons launch to intercept. Skipper's squadron we cut to, and he attacks a bomber formation with Archie, played by Edward Fox, leading Sergeant Andy, Ian McNabb, in yellow section as they fire at the Germans. Skipper himself sets a bomber on fire as Andy sees Me-109 fighters falling on them. Skipper calmly tells his men to break right and climb. It's Major Falker's Jagdgeschwader, or fighter squadron, as Skipper shoots one down. Sergeant Andy, concentrating on hitting one Me-109, gets another on his tail and his plane is hit. Archie yells, "Get out, Andy, jump!" which he manages to do. Landing back at their airfield, squadron leader Skipper is chatting to his ground crew when Sergeant Andy walks back, his wrapped up parachute in his arms and looking rather soggy. When Skipper says to him, "Did you get one?" he says, "All I got was a belly full of English Channel." So Andy's offered a lift in Skipper's car. He says, "I'd rather walk, sir." A little bit huffy, and he's met by, "Cut out the sir. All right, boy, get in." And it kind of lets us know that squadron leader Skipper, based on Sailor Milan, he's got no time to stand on ceremony. He doesn't care about the peripheries of service convention. He's just interested in shooting down Germans, and he's tough, but I can imagine full of his men probably full of respect for him. Reality, the bit about Dowding's attitude towards the Poles is accurately portrayed, although he was gracious enough to admit that he was wrong later in the battle, as we will see. I'm not sure it was a snobbiness from Dowding. He definitely was fairly aristocratic, but he was also pragmatic, and he was pragmatic enough to, as we say, to admit when he was wrong. Back to the movie, and Squadron Leader Canfield, played by Michael Caine, his squadron take off in formation, and we see his black Labrador looking on as they take off. In a sector control room, Air Vice Marshal Park is being told that 12 Group will protect his airfields whilst his squadrons are airborne. 12 Group, remember, were based in the Midlands and East Anglia. Canfield is directed to intercept, but they're spotted by a Luftwaffe fighter squadron. The Messerschmitts fall on the Spitfires and a dogfight ensues. We guess this is Major Fern's squadron because they have red noses on their aircraft, not the yellow ones of Falker's squadron. Several Spitfires explode or are shot down before we cut to an airfield where a very calm observer is heard on the radio saying, 20 plus Heinkel's heading straight for us. I'm taking cover. This is the observer corps chap up on the roof of one of the towers. Keith Park is furious because 12 Group haven't arrived to protect the southern airfields, and we see one of Canfield's pilots land in a smoking Spitfire and report that Squadron Leader Canfield has been killed. The dog looks on. The reality of that bit, I mean, the loss of Squadron Leader Canfield obviously is a fictional character, the Michael Caine character. It just demonstrates again the role of luck in air warfare. He flew into some bullets, one hit something vital, his aircraft blew up. Being brave, skilled and diligent increases your chances of survival, but a bullet, or more likely an explosive cannon shell from a Messerschmitt hitting your fuel tank, and it's all over no matter how good a pilot you are. The bit about the dog was a little bit of spoon feeding, but I think we can forgive them that. Meanwhile, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park arrives at Dowding's HQ and he's absolutely furious. We see him and Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, played by Patrick Wymark, arguing. Lee Mallory claims that his squadrons were up, but it takes time to assemble 40 or 50 aircraft en masse. It takes far too long, retorts Park. Lee Mallory says that all that matters is to shoot down large numbers of the enemy. Better to get 50 after they've hit the targets than 10 before. Park's response is, their targets are my airfields, and you're not getting 50. You're not even getting 10. Dowding interrupts and says that they're short of 200 pilots. Those that are nearing exhaustion. They're fighting for survival and losing. And both his group commanders stood in front of him. You can see them look at him with a kind of, oh, okay, this is not particularly good. Meanwhile, Squadron Leader Colin Harvey and Maggie Harvey are in a hotel and they're arguing about her job again. There's some fairly yawn-inducing personal relationship stuff that doesn't seem very well done, and therefore, it's not that I'm against trying to bring in personal relationship issues to a war film, but if you're going to, do it well. And this, I don't know, there's something, like I say, a lot of critics have criticised these elements, and I can't help thinking they're sort of shoehorned in. But as they are chatting and going from being romantic to arguing, we see German bombers in the night sky. Their navigator has realised they've experienced different winds from those expected and can't expect to find their target. The pilot says, we're not anywhere near London, are we? And he's told, no. So he says, okay, ditch the bombs and head home. In the London hotel, the Harveys realise they're actually being bombed because they are over London. Reality. The face-to-face confrontation between Park and Lee Mallory is fictional because they didn't actually come face-to-face in Dowding's HQ, but it does highlight the tensions felt between the two group commanders. Lee Mallory was a proponent of the big wing, as was Douglas Bader, one of his squadron leaders and then wing commander. Park believed in small units attacking as soon as they were able rather than loitering until several squadrons had joined up together. I think the idea was, a large mass of firepower, but then we're back to the argument, or one we haven't discussed yet, of how a squadron should form up in formation, wingtip to wingtip, or nicely spread out. The first concentrates your firepower, but makes you much less manoeuvrable. Anyway, more of that later. The accidental bombing of London and the subsequent RAF retaliation that I haven't actually covered yet is absolutely accurate. A navigationally embarrassed German Heinkel crew may have been responsible for saving the RAF's effectiveness and eventually persuading Hitler to postpone the planned invasion. Funny old world, eh? Because back to the movie, the bomber crew, when they land, the German bomber crew, are told attacks on London are strictly forbidden, and Field Marshal Kesselring says to them, "I'm sorry, it's out of my hands. You're to fly to Berlin and report to Reichsmarshal Goering." The boss, Kesselring, clearly expects the worst for them. They fly into Berlin, and they look quite relaxed, considering they might be expecting to be sent to, the Russian front hadn't opened yet, but I'm sure they'd be on the short list for when it did. But they're shocked to see Berlin lit up with absolutely no observance of blackout. They're told to report to a colonel the next morning, and as they're driving to their hotel, the lights go out and sirens start to wail. The two bomber pilots stop the car and stare at the night sky, reminding each other that Goering had said if Berlin was ever bombed, he could be called Meyer. Now, I've never really understood the significance of that. You can call me Meyer. I'm not sure if it's a derogatory name or a comedy name, but anyway, basically Goering was saying Berlin will never be bombed. We see Hitler addressing a packed auditorium of women, saying that if the RAF attacked them with 100 kilograms of bombs, they would retaliate with 1, 2, 3, 4,000 kilograms. He says, the English ask, "When am I coming?" And I say, "Don't worry, we are coming." And the crowd all leap to their feet, throwing Nazi salutes and chanting Sieg Heil. And that speech, given to an assembly of women's groups, is actually fairly accurately depicted here. Rolf Steiner plays Adolf Hitler. You never really see him close up, but the voice is a fair approximation of the sort of shrieking, ranting Hitler that we hear on recordings. Back in the movie, Goering's armed train arrives at Luftwaffe HQ in France. Goering, played by Hein Reiss, is greeted by Field Marshal Kesselring, played by Peter Hager, and taken on an inspection of the troops and airfields. Observing the English coast through binoculars, he watches as wave after wave of his aircraft fly overhead, heading west. Giggling like a fat kid in a candy shop, he almost dances as they cross, and he says, "If we lose now, we deserve to have our asses kicked." At an RAF sector squadron, they're plotting raids and directing squadron leader Skipper's squadron to intercept, but the fighters can't find any enemy. Realising the bomber streams are turning northwest, the controllers work out quite quickly that they're heading for London, whilst all the fighter squadrons are up covering airfields. The nearly disgraced bomber captain we last saw in Berlin is back in his cockpit, wondering where the RAF are. Bombs start falling on the capital as kids paddling in the Thames argue whether the bombers they can see are Messerschmitts or Heinkels. The raids continue into the night with a poignant scene of Tower Bridge with a burning city behind it. Firefighters battle flames as buildings collapse, and then we see Sergeant Andy from Skipper's squadron who's visiting his family. There'd been a bit earlier where he's saying to Archie that he's a bit angry with his wife. He said, "I arranged for them to be evacuated to the country. Then she said she's bored and they're back in London." But he finds his family safe and well in a church hall. He gives his kids toy Spitfires when an air raid warden comes in and says they're asking for volunteers to try and help free a trapped family. Andy goes to help and they dig their way through rubble trying to listen. Walking back to the church hall, a young lad tells Sergeant Andy that he can't be a Spitfire pilot. Only officers can fly Spitfires. They get there and they're having a bit of banter, and as they get back to the church hall, it's blazing and Andy learns it's taken a direct hit. His family is lost. Now, this is quite well done and it's quite poignant, and it's got far more reminding of the emotional and relationship impact that war has than Susanna York and Christopher Plummer arguing about her posting. I don't know, but yeah, it's fictional, but the tragedy of both the family he's gone to try and help dig out being dead and then his own family being killed, whilst not specifically true, does show how the battle touched so many lives. And of course it wasn't only London that suffered a blitz. Many industrial towns in the Midlands and the North, particularly on the eastern coast, also suffered hugely. Back to the movie, and we're at Squadron Leader Skipper's house, and the fighter leader is leaving his sleeping wife, checking on his kids. Then he knocks on the guest room door before going outside to his car. A bleary looking Andy has stayed at the boss's house, but he gets in the car and without a word they drive off, and you can see that Sergeant Andy's returning to duty. At the sector control room, Park sees an RAF squadron plot labelled T5. Asking what it is, he's told it's the Polish squadron under training, and he says, "Get them out of there, get them down." And then we hear this.
Black Hawk leader to A flight. Turn to port and steer 230.
Niemcy! Niemcy! Na dole! Nie widzę ich! Gdzie? Na dole! Na prawo! Idę na nich! Widzę ich!
Stop that Polish chatter and steer 230.
Repeat, please.
2,
Repeat, please.
3, 0.
Repeat, please. Repeat, please.
Now just shut up, the lot of you, and follow me. Unless you're blind as well as... Oh, God's truth.
1. The RAF is not a flying circus.
Po pierwsze, lotnictwo brytyjskie nie jest latającym cyrkiem.
2. Strict RT procedure will be observed at all times.
Po drugie, procedura radiowa będzie ściśle przestrzegana przez cały czas.
And it is never, repeat, never to be used.
I nigdy, powtarzam, nigdy nie będzie używana
For private Polish chit-chat.
na prywatne polskie rozmówki.
Finally, and God alone knows why, I've received the following signal. Congratulations, as of today, this squadron is operational. Signed, Keith Park, Air Vice Marshal AOC 11 Group.
So a lot of the critics say, oh yeah, it's a nice light-hearted moment, a bit of humour with the Polish squadron. And given my research about this subject over many years, I kind of find that a little bit condescending or patronising. The squadron leader Edwards, as he's played in the movie by Barry Foster, is another fictional name. He's based on squadron leader Kellett, who was the initial commanding officer of 303 Squadron. He did indeed get quite angry with them at times for not obeying orders, and what we're going to do now is I've got to pronounce some Polish names, and I think there's nothing so disrespectful as butchering names that are from a foreign language. So my good friend and our theme music composer Jules Cisek, who, although American, was born in Poland and speaks fluent Polish, has recorded the names for me. So when you hear a slightly different voice saying these names, obviously it's not me, it's Jules. So the truth of what happened. The 303 Squadron, the Polish Squadron, were indeed up on a training mission on the 30th of August 1940. Squadron leader Kellett got an order over the radio to take them home, and whether they all did the repeat please bit, I'm not sure, but certainly one of them, and this was Flying Officer
Ludwik Paszkiewicz,
who asked permission of Squadron Leader Kellett to peel off and attack a German aircraft. At the time, they thought it was a Messerschmitt 110. Subsequently, it turned out to be a Dornier 17. Refused permission, he asked again, was refused again, and went off and shot it down anyway. Kellett said he did deliver a telling off to Paszkiewicz when they got back to base for about a minute, and then enthusiastically congratulated the Polish veteran and bought him a beer. Kellett then vigorously recommended that these veteran pilots be released to operational status. He was on the phone to Group HQ that evening, and indeed it was the next day that they were released. Paszkiewicz would shoot down 6 German aircraft, becoming an ace, but would be killed less than a month later after being damaged by a Messerschmitt 109 and trying to force land at Borough Green. Back to the movie. Realising his mistake about the Polish squadrons, Dowding agreed to make them, the Czechs and the Canadians operational. Now, I can't see why the Canadians hadn't been operational, because there's hardly a language barrier. Dowding and Park stood on a balcony, or they'll stand on a balcony, watching the orange glow of London burning. Dowding bemoans that they can do absolutely nothing to stop them, but then he and Park both observe that 11 Group's airfields get a respite, the German fighters will have much less loiter time, and this time they'll all come within range of 12 Group. This may be the Germans' biggest mistake. The next day we see squadron after squadron directed to headings and heights by RAF fighter control as the German bomber formations come on. The senior controller looks quite chipper for once, as the RAF plots nearly match the number of German raid plots. There's some beautiful aerial sequences showing Spitfire squadrons rolling into the attack, and then a huge dogfight begins with aircraft trailing smoke, firing, diving, turning, sometimes exploding. One of the Polish pilots, who's nicknamed Ox, is shot down but manages to bail out. Landing in a field, he's quickly surrounded by farm workers armed with pitchforks, who don't believe he's an Allied airman because he has an accent, and they assume this means he's German. Thankfully, they decide to capture him and not kill him.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, my arse, you Bosch bastard. Put your hands up. Come on, put them up. Go on, blimey, your mitts, mate, your mitts. Put them up there, go on. Go on, get going. Go on, March. I'll give you a good afternoon.
In reality, some Polish and other foreign accented Allied pilots did report being roughly handled by locals who thought them to be German. I have read of reports of rumours of such aircrew being killed, but no one seems to be able to verify any of these reports, and I can't even remember where I read them many years ago, not researching for this episode. The aerial sequences of the wave after wave of German aircraft coming over, being met by squadron after squadron, is pretty factual. The British squadrons kept on coming, and what they don't really go into here is the confusion amongst the German aircrew, which a lot of the memoirs say is each morning or each evening their commanders would say, "Fantastic job today. Tomorrow it's very unlikely you'll see very many RAF there, they're virtually destroyed." And the German crews were reporting, well, they still seem to be coming up in the same numbers, if not more of them. Some great sequences of the aerial shots, although the sharp-eyed will notice that some clips get shown over and over again. And one of the Heinkels that got shot down on Squadron Leader Colin Harvey's northern raid definitely seems to have crashed into this bit as well. Back to the movie, and we see a lone Heinkel bomber streaming smoke with injured crewmen on board, and it makes it to the coast and skims the waves trying to get back to France. In the harbour, where earlier we saw Goering watching his air armada heading to Britain, the Heinkel makes it back to crash land, and the pilot looking on as rescue crews try to extricate his crew. Goering has his assembled commanders on a hillside berating them for not having finished the RAF off. Kesselring defends his airmen, saying the RAF have changed tactics, attacking in large numbers. Goering suggests cowardice and says the fighters must stay with the bombers. Kesselring argues that they'll lose the advantage of height and surprise, but Goering overrules him. Calming down, Goering says, "But my friends, I'm here to help you. What can I do? What do you want?" And he asks Major Fern, who just sort of clicks his heels and says, "Nothing." And then he asks Falker. Now, this is in German, but I'm going to play the clip because he says to Falker, "What do you want?" And Falker says, "Give me a squadron of Spitfires," much to Goering's disgust. The reason I'm going to play it, even though it's in German, listen to the music that comes just after Falker's answer. Remember the music in the movies supplementary we did? This is telling us you don't even have to see Goering's expression to know that Falker has just said something that's really annoyed him.
Gibt es irgendetwas, was ich für Sie tun kann? Föhn. Falke.
Jawohl, Herr Reichsmarschall. Geben Sie mir eine Staffel Spitfire.
Carrying on with the movie, we see a further raid and young officer Archie, played by Edward Fox, repeatedly attacking a Heinkel over London. Streaming smoke, the bomber flies over Buckingham Palace before crashing. Archie, who was also damaged, bailed out and lands in a greenhouse, smashing through the glass top of it, where, as he disentangles himself from a parachute, he's offered a cigarette by a young boy from a cigarette box, and he says, "Thanks awfully, old chap." Meanwhile, Goering is mounting his train, firing at Kesselring that the weather won't hold forever and he must finish the RAF now. That's an order. So, how true is this? Well, Goering did bawl his men out, and he did accuse them of cowardice and incompetence, and incredibly, for an ex-fighter pilot himself, he was quite happy to order the fighters to remain with the bomber formations, in close escort, sacrificing height, speed and surprise. Falker's request for a Spitfire squadron was indeed made by Adolf Galland, but he later said he only did it to annoy the Reichsmarshal, who he couldn't stand. He actually, whilst he thought the Spitfire more manoeuvrable and therefore a better defensive aircraft, overall preferred his Messerschmitt. So, fair enough. The bit of Archie attacking a Heinkel is kind of based on a sergeant pilot, Sergeant Ray Holmes, who did indeed, in full daylight and viewed by thousands of Londoners, keep attacking a bomber that he felt was heading for Buckingham Palace. And he eventually ran out of ammunition, so he rammed it and incredibly managed to bail out and survive. And the bomber did crash near Victoria Station, I think. Anyway, back to the movie. Section Officer Maggie is introduced to a new fighter controller, Squadron Leader Tom Evans. He proves to be a badly burned former Hurricane pilot. She looks shocked but manages a smile. And after a phone call with her husband Colin, we then see him taking off, and he's in a squadron, in a dogfight, and he's hit. His smoking Spitfire spirals towards the ground as flames fill the cockpit. Jamie, the young pilot we'd seen at the beginning of the film, who seems to be back in the same squadron as Colin Harvey, lands and says, no, he's fine, I saw him bail out and the parachute opened. Back with Maggie Harvey, she's walking past Group Captain Baker and seeing his expression, and he can't really think what to say to her, realises something's happened to her husband Colin. Baker says he's all right, they can do wonders these days, and her first question is he badly burned? Meanwhile, back at Harvey's squadron, Jamie's told by the new squadron leader to take over Red Section. Jamie, who we saw as a raw novice only a few months before, is now the veteran as he meets his wingmen, who have 7 and 10 hours on Spitz respectively. With little time for extensive briefing, they're thrown right into the action. Again, unfortunately, this business of Maggie meeting a badly burned pilot, then being told that Colin's been shot down, and as we saw in Flames, it's pretty lame and kind of, I don't know, it doesn't really make you feel very warm towards her character, because she's just concerned that her husband may not look as handsome as he used to. Again, yeah, I think they could have lost all the Maggie and Colin personal things, but that's just me. Back to the movie. At Park's HQ, Winston Churchill is visiting and is told by Park all his squadrons are in the air with no reserves left. More dogfight sequences ensue, with Jamie desperately trying to shepherd his new pilots as they go into the attack. Red 3 becomes disorientated and lost, and we see a Spitfire pilot bail out, but his parachute fails to open as he hurtles towards the ground. More aircraft are hit on both sides, and there's quite a poignant moment as we see a WAF controller trying to raise a pilot on the radio. In truth, Churchill did visit Park's HQ and was briefed as we're shown. There are no more reserves. By all accounts, Churchill was charming, attentive, supportive and very respectful to all the staff there, and he was particularly impressed with the WAF plotters. But then you read that Winston had a soft spot for pretty young women, so I don't mean that in any kind of like Harvey Weinstein way, but yeah, he could be very charming, I'm sure. Back in the movie, and we see Major Falker's Luftwaffe mess that night. Several empty places and the men are just silent. The next morning, formations of Heinkel bombers take off as Spitfires and Hurricanes are wheeled out of their hangars in preparation. Bombs continue to fall in the night in London as whole communities spend their nights in underground stations, turned into shelters as the BBC News announced the score from the previous day, bringing cheers from the Londoners in the station. Dowding gets a call from the Air Minister about trouble in the US, where German sources are saying their claims are wildly exaggerated. Dowding, as calm as ever, says to the Minister he's not really interested in propaganda. If we're right, they'll give up. If they're right, they'll be in London in a week. We see Skipper's squadron arrive on the flight line and settle into chairs. The phone rings, bringing a range of responses from the exhausted pilots, one of whom vomits outside the door, but it's only a call to say their tea is being brought. At the Lake Camfield squadron, Jamie and the French pilot he rescued at the start of the movie wait with the other pilots, while squadron leader Edwards and the Poles of 303 squadron are also waiting. Park arrives in his sector control room to be told, they're late this morning, sir. But across the channel, we see soldiers piling life jackets up and marching away. Goering is back, yelling at Kesselring and Falke that they've betrayed him. Dowding leaves his office for the terrace outside and gazes into the sky. The empty sky. The end titles start with Churchill's famous tribute, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." We will outro with that speech and a nice little bit of Edward Elgar. There follows across the screen a list of the nationalities of the Allied pilots who took part, along with how many were killed. Taking part in the battle were 1,822 British, 141 Polish, 88 Canadians, 86 Czechs, and they were joined by Americans, French, Jamaicans, and there's even one Israeli listed, which is interesting as the country didn't exist till 1948, but I think we know what they mean. And then the German casualties are listed as well. The end. And yeah, takes quite a bit of wrapping up, really. The Germans who have written, this is a reality check, by the way, this is the wrap up of the movie, but I'm afraid I haven't finished when I get to the end of this bit. The Germans who've written about their experiences in the battle all say that each day they expected to see less and less, or fewer and fewer British fighters due to their own side's propaganda, and each day it seemed to be the opposite. You can understand this would be pretty demoralising. The scene where a furious Goering departs on his train shows Kessery giving a Nazi salute, whereas Falke gives the standard Luftwaffe salute, similar to the British Navy salute or the American Army salute, with the hand flat. Adolf Galland protested the scene because Kesselring was famous for never giving the Nazi salute. However, the scene remained. So why did the Nazis not manage to defeat the RAF? It's a complex and many-faceted argument with about as many opinions as there are historians airing them. Nick Shepley, in his History Explained podcast on the Battle of Britain, suggested an interesting idea. He said the Nazis were under a cult of personality dictatorship, and in such regimes to suggest that any project is not going according to plan is seen as defeatism, or worse, criticism of those who formulated the plan. To this end, Goering only believed the reports that reflected his wishes rather than the truth. The demoralising effect of the Luftwaffe pilots being repeatedly told the RAF was on its knees and today you won't meet many fighters, and then meeting just as many, is pretty predictable. The bombing of Berlin in retaliation to the bombing of London, which we now know was accidental but didn't seem that way to the wartime British government, it had no military benefit at all. Neither did the Blitz in any meaningful way. The attacks on aircraft production factories in the Midlands and the North had some effect, but the attacks on London and the flawed belief this would destroy Britain's morale and resolve proved to have the opposite effect. It says something about nationalistic pride and hubris that the Allied bomber commanders would make exactly the same mistake about the German population. The controversial suggestion that I've mentioned when we've been previewing this in previous episodes is really to do with what the Battle of Britain achieved. Examination of the results take absolutely nothing away from the incredible courage and dedication of the air crew and their supporting ground crews and controllers. The young Luftwaffe crews were very similar, whatever we think about the regime under which they were serving. But did the RAF's victory really stop an imminent invasion? Several prominent historians have suggested that even Hitler knew it was only a bluff. Gather an invasion force, batter the air defences, and surely Britain would come to peace talks. Hitler apparently had no particular desire to conquer Britain, and he, or at least his senior staff, knew how difficult the English Channel can be to cross. The German Navy was never a match for the British Navy, and while some historians have said, there's no way that the Admiralty would have risked the battleships and cruisers, the argument is you don't need them. The best defensive ships would have been frigates and destroyers. And don't forget, the Germans were planning to cross the Channel in Rhine barges. These are not designed to deal with open sea. The destroyers wouldn't even have had to fire their guns, as the wash of a fast-moving destroyer would just have flipped the barges over. Consider how close run a thing D-Day proved to be. With the largest armada the world has ever seen, in purpose-built assault landing craft, near total air superiority, yes, accepted it was a wider part of the Channel they were crossing, but it does give you an idea of the tenuous nature of long seaborne invasions. Also, whilst the British Army had lost a lot of equipment in the evacuation from Dunkirk, many of the men were far from demoralised, believing, wrongly in most cases, that they'd only had to retreat because the French were unable to hold their line, and therefore we had to move back to keep the line intact. So it's possible that the Battle of Britain didn't actually prevent Hitler from doing what he quite possibly never intended to do in the first place. In another sense, though, I think it's almost underplayed the significance of the Battle of Britain, and possibly undervalued. Germany had been on a roll of constant success and victory. In 1938 they annexed the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia and Austria. In 1939 they invaded Poland. In 1940 France, Belgium, the Netherlands. Earlier they'd invaded Denmark and Norway. They seemed unstoppable. What the RAF provided to Britain, her allies and the watching world was the first defeat, or at least setback, to this seemingly unstoppable military machine. The myth was punctured. Now, some versions of the movie have Churchill's famous tribute to the few. Others have him saying this.
This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
Now, you would think that that could quite possibly be applied to the Battle of Britain, but in fact, this is not the end or the beginning of the end, but it may be the end of the beginning, wasn't said for another 2 years, in fact more than 2 years, November 1942, after the Battle of El Alamein in North Africa. And it's worth remembering again when you think about that time scale that here, with hindsight, we look back at these neatly pigeonholed periods. The Battle of Britain was the 10th of July to the 30th of October, I think, or it might be the other way around. Think about, at the time though, that it was just happening. There was no end in sight. And to be able to turn around defeat into a victory of sorts, and certainly was played that way, did have a massive effect. I mean, 3 years to El Alamein from the outbreak of war, and only then Churchill starts talking about the end of the beginning. That's quite a beginning. And of course, the involved nations were only halfway through the war at that stage. So, the movie. I think it's quite balanced. I think it portrays the Luftwaffe crews not as monocled, jackboot wearing Nazis, but as very similar to the RAF pilots opposing them, which I think is a far more realistic view of it. A bit like Tora Tora Tora, which we certainly hope to show at some stage, to review at some stage, about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. There was input from former Luftwaffe veterans and RAF veterans. The romantic aspect I think I've dealt with. I don't think it's necessary. And the movie's overly stocked with both Spitfires and officers. There were more NCOs than were shown, and certainly much more Hurricanes, who shot down over 70% of the German aircraft downed during the battle. Entertainment, I mean, for me, it is a solid 8, pushing 9. History, I think, 7. It doesn't tell many lies, but I just don't understand why you have fictional names. But there is one element that almost drags it down to a 6 for me, and this is the matter of the polls. As I mentioned at the end of the intro, that's pretty much it for the movie. Please stay with me though, because I am about to go into one about the way Poland's contribution to the Second World War and the Allied victory has pretty much been written out of the history books by everyone who isn't Polish. So, Poland. Let's look at the beginning of the war. The invasion. They've got the Germans coming in from the west, then the Soviets invade from the east. Poland lasts a month, and despite Britain and France having declared war in support of Poland, they actually gave no material help whatsoever. The first myth I want to dispel is the one that I believed for years, until a few years ago reading a history book, and this was about Polish cavalry charging at German tanks, which is kind of quixotic in its the image it builds up. On the 1st of September 1939, on the day of invasion, the 18th Pomeranian Uhlans, who were light cavalry, came across some resting German infantry and artillery, and they charged them and they dispersed them. Although the lance for a couple of years had not been official equipment, a lot of the Polish cavalry retained the lance, And you can imagine if you're German infantry, you're thinking, whoa, what is going on here? And they ran away. German light tanks and armour cars arrived on the scene. The cavalry retreated, suffering some casualties. When German, Italian and American journalists tour the battlefield later, they see parked up tanks amongst dead horses and cavalrymen and make the obvious and erroneous conclusion and report that the Poles had been charging at German armoured vehicles on horseback. This was used as propaganda by the Nazis, saying, oh, look how backwards the Poles are, and later by the Soviets reinforcing the myth, saying, look, the brave working class cavalrymen were betrayed by incompetent aristocratic commanders. After this, bearing in mind that at this stage of the war the Soviets and the Nazis are allied, the Soviets with over 4,400 Polish officers murdered them, all of them, in the Katyn forest. In 1943, Germans discover the bodies, all of them shot in the back, and blame the Soviets, quite correctly. The Soviets counter-blame the Germans. A 1942 US Congressional Committee decided it was the Soviets, but this was dismissed by the Russians as anti-Soviet propaganda as the Cold War gained traction. Poland's puppet communist governments have had to go along with the Soviet version until 1989, when Lech Wałęsa's first democratic government immediately shifted the blame to the Soviets. In 1990, President Gorbachev finally admitted Soviet responsibility and a memorial was built at the spot, which is near Smolensk. In 2010, Vladimir Putin and Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, joined together at memorial service. 3 days later, the Polish President,
Lech Kaczyński,
with his wife and 94 other people, were killed when a Polish Air Force plane crash-landed trying to get into Smolensk in bad weather. Code Breakers is my next subject, and The Imitation Game, a movie about Alan Turing and the Bletchley Park Code Breakers, is a movie we'll cover at some stage, so I don't want to go into exhaustive detail now. But in the film, the Polish contribution to cracking the Enigma codes used by the German military was reduced to a single, slightly dismissive line when Turing is showing off his Enigma simulator. He says, oh, it's based on an earlier Polish design, but infinitely more advanced. And this is almost a U571 level dismissal of a huge contribution. In the pre-war years, Britain was still using linguists to crack codes, whereas the Polish had realised it was a mathematical problem. Bringing together some of Poland's top mathematicians, and there was a real flowering of mathematics in Poland in the 30s, they managed to crack the early Enigma versions, and, as war started to look inevitable, they shared this information with Britain, Turing and some of his team travelling to Poland. 3 Polish code breakers in particular should have received credit for this. They were
Henryk Zygalski, Marian Rejewski,
and
Jerzy Rosycki.
These 3 being credited with cracking and explaining the Enigma system, and without them, Turing and Bletchley Park would have been starting from a much weaker and shakier position. Okay, now I'd like to talk about the Anders Army. After the Nazis invaded Russia, Churchill and Roosevelt persuaded Stalin to release the tens of thousands of Polish prisoners of war he had in prison camps and gulags. They were formed into an army under command of General Anders, a Polish commander, and although the Russians provided transport for some stages, large numbers of them walked from Russia to Palestine to join up with General Montgomery's 8th Army. They formed the 2nd Polish Corps and would go on to fight with great distinction, their most famous success being the assault on Monte Cassino, a medieval monastery atop a mountain that the Allies had to capture to be able to safely pass by on their way up Italy. British, American and Free French attacks had all been repulsed, and it was the 2nd Polish Corps men who finally captured the summit, suffering nearly 50% casualties along the way. In honour of their sacrifice, a Polish military cemetery was built on Monte Cassino. When we get around to covering A Bridge Too Far, the airborne drops on the Rhine bridges, we'll also examine the role of the 1st Polish Airborne Brigade that's mentioned in the movie, their commander being played by Gene Hackman, but whose contribution deserved the same level of attention as that of the British powers in Arnhem, and sadly in the movie it really doesn't. After the war, General Anders remained in London, having been stripped of his command and charged with sedition by the communist Polish puppet government in Warsaw. He remained in London and died there in 1970, when in accordance with his wishes he was buried with his men on the Monte Cassino Polish military cemetery. So, back to the Battle of Britain. 303 Squadron. 303 Squadron were also known as the
Kościuszko
Squadron, being so named after a Polish war hero from a previous era. Although they didn't join the Battle of Britain until the very end of August, the official dates of the battle being 10th of July to the 31st of October, they finished as the highest scoring squadron in the RAF. They were also the squadron with the highest kill-to-loss ratio, so these were no suicidal head-on attacks. 30 Squadron also contained the battle's highest scoring ace. He was actually a Czech pilot who chose to fly with the Poles, Sergeant
Józef Franciszek,
who shot down 17 German aircraft, and sadly Joseph was killed in October 1940, only just over a month later. So why were the Poles so effective? Well, apart from courage, skill and the tenacity of exiles, they were all veterans of fighting the Luftwaffe. Those Polish pilots who flew in the RAF had nearly all met the Germans in the air in Poland, then escaped to France, where nearly all of them were enrolled into the French Air Force, and then on to Britain when it became clear that France was doomed. They had learned, as had the Luftwaffe, that the most effective formation for fighters was a loose grouping of 3 or 4 aircraft, usually in line abreast and each 100 to 200 metres apart. This way, each pilot is close enough to cover his wingmen, but far enough apart to be able to scan for the enemy and manoeuvre freely without worrying about crashing into each other. At the outset of the war, the RAF insisted on wingtip to wingtip formations designed to concentrate a squadron's firepower, or, as one foreign pilot serving in the RAF put it, to increase the chances of actually hitting anything German. This meant the formation was very unwieldy, and only really the leading pilot was free to look for the enemy, because everyone else in the squadron was worrying about cracking into the wingtips of the people next to them. Those RAF squadrons that had flown in France had generally quickly discarded the tight official formations for the Finger Four, as the loose style that the Luftwaffe used became called. During the Battle of Britain, RAF squadrons persisting with the official formations were often savaged, and it was a refusal to fly in such a suicidal formation that contributed to the Poles' reputation as being ill-disciplined, a reputation that has sadly persisted, particularly amongst some British RAF veterans, possibly smarting at these foreign Johnnies coming along late and then scoring more kills. To round up the armed forces contribution by Poland, we need to mention their navy. 3 Polish destroyers and 2 submarines escaped to Britain in 1939, and more warships were leased from the British and manned by Polish sailors, and they all acquitted themselves very well. So in summary, a country of some 34 million people in 1939 that had been overrun by both Nazis and Soviets managed to contribute 250,000 servicemen and women during the war. I don't think it's exaggeration to say their contribution was far in excess of what could be reasonably expected. And how has that contribution been recognised and celebrated? Well, outside of Poland, it hasn't. On the 8th of June 1946, London hosted a VE Day parade which saw every single Allied nation represented, except Poland. 25 Polish pilots were invited, most of them still serving in the RAF, but they declined the invitation due to no other Polish military presence being permitted. Why, I hear you roar. Stalin had placed a puppet communist government in Warsaw, whilst the Polish government in exile, the pre-war Polish government, remained in London. Stalin had made it clear that any representation of the Polish forces in exile was tantamount to recognising the former government, and he found this unacceptable. The British and American governments, now led by Clement Attlee and Harry Truman respectively, seemed so scared of antagonising Stalin that they decided to placate him and exclude the Poles from the parade. Perfidious Albion is a phrase that describes the treachery of dealing with Britain, and it's hard to argue against. In a final irony, the Polish First Army that had fought with the Red Army right up to the capture of Berlin were fully represented in the victory parades held in Moscow. France, who had contributed only slightly more troops, about 50,000 more, to the Free French troops in exile than Poland did, and with a larger population plus a sizable empire from where most of the Free French troops came, they found themselves sat alongside the US, Russia and Britain at the victors' table. This despite having only lasted 2 weeks longer before surrender, and then, at least at a governmental level, had gone on to collaborate with the Nazis. These reasons are purely pragmatic and economic, and we don't need to go into them now. But just know it was Churchill who insisted on French inclusion. It had nothing to do with honour. It had all to do with British self-interest and creating a balance in Europe. Poland were left to endure 50 years of Soviet domination, so when I hear British people complaining about all them Poles coming over here, I really have to grit my teeth not to launch into a similar rant to that which you've all just had to endure. If there's one country in the world to whom Britain owes a huge debt of gratitude, it is Poland. I know Americans may be saying, hang on, buddy, we kind of helped you out quite a lot too, and it's very true, you did. The US won the war in the West and definitely speeded up the defeat of Nazi Germany, despite arguments that eventually Russia would have probably done that on their own. But Britain has been repaying that debt to America since World War II ended, both financially, emotionally and morally. We've never even officially acknowledged Poland's contribution. Here endeth the rant. Thank you for listening, and I do have to say a big thank you to Jules for the Polish pronunciation.
Okay, I hope that helps.
Yes, Jules, it certainly did. For anybody who does want to know more, particularly about the Polish involvement in World War II, the book that led me down this path some years ago that Jules Chisek and I had exchanged comments on was For Your Freedom and for Ours, the Kosciuszko Squadron by Lynn Olson and Stanley Cloud. I'll put a link to this in the show notes, so if you just go to the episodes page, you need to scroll to the bottom, look for the blue links, and you can click on episode 34, The Battle of Britain, and in the show notes you'll see the links. I use Amazon.com, but of course you don't have to use Amazon to buy your books. I use Amazon.co.uk, being a Brit, but it will give you the title and the authors' names. In some countries, that book is known as A Question of Honour, the Kosciuszko Squadron, by the same authors. I'll put that link as well. Another excellent book by Norman Davies is The Trail of Hope, The Anders Army and an Odyssey Across 3 Continents. And there's also No Greater Ally, The Untold Story of Poland's Forces in World War II by Kenneth Koskodan. I thoroughly recommend all 3 of those books. And also, off the specific subject, there's a book I read recently by Tim Marshall called Prisoners of Geography. Prisoners of Geography is a look at the different parts of the world, different continents, and how the geography of those areas has guided and advised political and military strategies and decisions. It only came out last year. It's very recent. I've just read it. I just lent it to Andrew, so I'm sure he'll be ploughing through it. So it is something I thoroughly recommend. It does kind of explain what otherwise might seem slightly irrational decisions. So looking forward, Victoria and Abdul in 2 weeks' time. I hope you enjoy this rather long show for a solo presenter, and we will leave you with a bit of Edward Elgar's Nimrod from the Enigma Variations and Churchill's tribute to the RAF. Let's just remember, it wasn't just Brits in the RAF. So to those men and women I say thank you, and to you, our dear listeners, I also say thank you for listening, and we'll speak to you next time. Bye-bye.
The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.